Good afternoon, and thank you very much again to the conference organizers for inviting me here. It's really a joy to be here with you this afternoon. And I am not going to dive into the policy details of what a Green New Deal might look like. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk about this broad, overarching philosophical frame called just transition. And I'll tell you why. It's very obvious that we need to transition away from our destructive fossil fuel-based economic system. But transition to what and how? What's the end product and what does the process look like? I think it should be obvious to anyone who cares about social and economic justice that both the end product and the process need to be just, hence just transition. And I should also mention that I've structured my presentation as an interactive question and answer session with you. So I'm not just going to be talking at you, I'm going to be asking you questions, and I want you to answer. I want you to engage those brain cells and answer. I mean, I know it can be hard on a warm afternoon, but hey, let's try our best. Okay, so do I point it at the screen or point it there? Okay. So here's what I would call an official, you could call it official, definition of just transition. It's from ITUC, which is a global federation of labor unions. And it says, just transition focuses on jobs, livelihoods, and ensuring that no one is left behind as we race to reduce emissions, protect the climate, and advance social and economic justice. So does anyone notice any questionable assumptions in this definition? Yes? Well, certainly yes. Though I would respond to that scientists at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said that technically a transition is possible. The remaining question is political will, but I guess that's what you're getting at. Yeah. Yes, certainly. Health and education play into it, and I will get into that, but I'm going to give you a few hints on the next slide and see if I can get more ideas. So, are we racing to reduce emissions and protect the climate? What's happening in the United States? Exactly. Can we have a couple of hands up maybe instead of everyone trying to talk at once? Anyone? Yes.
Very recently, the so-called EPA, which used to be the Environmental Protection Agency, decided to take away the rule about efficient lamps, which is an example of going in the exact wrong direction, adding fuel to the fire of climate change.
Anyone else? Yes.
It doesn't address urgency. It doesn't address issues about our own oil production across the United States. It doesn't address our own fossil fuel emissions. It doesn't address the damage we do around the world through our military, which is the leading institutional user of fossil fuels and emissions. So it doesn't address the broader issues of how climate change is impacting frontline communities. So it's really very lacking, in my view. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I don't think I even need to throw open the question of what's happening in Brazil right now, right? Elsewhere in the world, can anyone provide a couple of examples? Especially, I'm looking for examples from so-called liberal countries who are criticizing the United States for not taking action quickly enough. Yes, ma'am?
In Australia, they recently elected a Trump lookalike, and within days, he licensed the Adani coal mine, which Australia has kept from happening for many years now. This will supply coal to places like India and China, who are still very dependent on it. And Australia didn't need to do this. They're a prosperous country, and they were able to be prosperous without being the biggest supplier of coal to the world.
Alberta, Canada, tar sands.
I was waiting for someone to say Canada. Now, here's a country that claims to be, oh, so liberal and leading the world on climate action. Meanwhile, they are producing one of the dirtiest known fuels to humanity, which is tar sands oil. And let me also add, they're doing it by stealing indigenous lands, okay? And they're trying to export those tar sand oils all over the world. They're trying to ram a pipeline through the United States, again through indigenous land, the Keystone XL pipeline. And they're trying to build a pipeline out to their own west coast, to British Columbia, again going through indigenous land. And now the government of Canada actually owns that pipeline. They bought the pipeline from the private company, Kinder Morgan, that used to own it, right? And another example I will give you is Germany, which is continuing to produce coal. In spite of, making a big deal about their energy transition, they are continuing to produce coal. So, moral of the story is that nowhere in the world are we racing to reduce emissions and protect the climate at anything close to the scale and speed at which we need to do it, okay? And are we racing to advance social and economic justice? I'm almost laughing as I'm reading this to you. It sounds like such a joke. But can we get one example from something happening in our communities here in the US?
I'll just mention from the sermon this morning that we've elected a white supremacist administration in the United States.
Oh, yeah. Ma'am over there.
Detroit schools are still segregated.
I saw your question very appropriately, or at least the way that it was originally stated here. Are we racing to reduce emissions and protect the environment? Racing being an example of a competition, which is a form of trying to advance positively toward the future, which is good, provided that the competition has good rules and good participants as such. An example, that just to be there are positive things going on. Racing as a competition, I would take an example of a program that's been happening for certainly over a decade called the Solar Decathlon. Solar Decathlon, a competition between university students to design the house of the future for today. Using today's technology, what would be the best house that's environmentally conscious, socially conscious, affordable, aesthetically pleasing, everything of that as a competition. So that is a competition that's attempting, with good rules and good participants, to achieve a better future.
And I'll quickly give one more example before going on to other questions. So I'll bring it right home here to Columbia Heights. Does anyone remember what this neighborhood used to look like 15 years ago? Predominantly black and brown, right? Now look at this neighborhood today. Look at, as you get out of the metro, that huge shopping complex with the glittering Target and Best Buy and stuff like that. Did you know that used to be a little block of immigrant-owned businesses, right? All wiped out to make room for big business, to make room for capitalism. The process of gentrification that is unfolding in our towns and cities across the country. That's a profound injustice that on one hand is very localized, on the other hand, it's a pattern that repeats itself in cities across the country and cities across the world, let me mention that, okay? Next question on the border, and again, that's so obvious and so much in the limelight that I don't even feel like I need to go into this much. What about elsewhere in the world? Can anyone mention a couple of examples of how we are actually not promoting social and economic justice in other parts of the world? Yes, ma'am.
I think I can speak really loud. Okay, fair enough. I think a good example is how the U.S. subsidizes our farmers, which puts our prices below market rate for commodities, which doesn't allow developing nations to enter the market fairly with their own commodities. Likewise, when we give loans through the IMF or the World Bank, we put restrictions on those countries from not subsidizing the same product. So we're saying we want the market to drive things while we're totally subjugating the market here.
Absolutely. And I'll quickly give one more example before moving on to the next slide. So someone mentioned the Adani coal mine in Australia. Okay, a little bit of background about this company, Adani. Okay, it's owned by a billionaire from India named Gautam Adani. Right? And do people know much about the current government in India or anything about its politics? It's worse than that. No, it's actually worse than that. Yes, precisely. And he said he's a Hindu supremacist. I would go, even one level further and say that he represents the fascist wing of Indian politics, right? Here is a government that is actively marginalizing and targeting mainly the Muslim minority in India, but also people who are, indigenous peoples known as Adivasi peoples in India, or Dalits, who are the people who are the lowest in the Hindu caste hierarchy in India, etc. And Adani, the coal billionaire who is plundering Australia, also happens to be one of the biggest financial backers of the Modi government in India. So there's a very close nexus between between sections of capital in India and this fascist movement in India that is, so viciously targeting and attacking religious and ethnic minorities in the country. And that's just one example. I could also talk about Brazil and the Brazilian government's attacks on indigenous Brazilians and Afro-Brazilians and LGBTQ folks in Brazil, etc. So we are not, as humanity, as a global, community of nations, racing to advance social and economic justice just about anywhere, unfortunately. Okay. Another point in that definition from the ITUC was about protecting jobs and livelihoods. So this may be an obvious question, but I'll pose it to you anyway. So what, other than jobs and livelihoods, do people and communities need to thrive?
They need to be protected from environmental hazards that affect their health.
Yes, obviously, people need clean air and clean water. And another person earlier mentioned health and education, right? What else? Yes, ma'am?
Access to healthy and affordable food.
Sorry?
Access to healthy and affordable food.
Yep. Healthy and affordable food.
Strong civic society, communities, and support networks.
Absolutely. It's not just about things like food and water and housing. It's also thriving, healthy, democratic, bottom-up social institutions. We humans need that as a species. What is missing and who are missing if we really want to ensure that no one is left behind?
So I will pass the mic on in a second, but one thing I do want to say about this, and it was one of the things I first thought about when I read what you were showing earlier. When we say no one is left behind, to me that it assumes we're all starting from the same starting point and that we're given equal opportunity to overcome these barriers, and that is not true. And so I think that there is, a degree of, or a lack of acknowledgement of white supremacy and the enduring legacy of racism in this definition.
So before I move on to the next slide, just a point of information. Now, there's a reason the International Trade Union Confederation came up with this definition, flawed though it may be. I'm just, just so as not to make them appear, more negative, just to say that they were operating in good faith, even though their definition ended up being somewhat flawed. The term just transition was actually coined by organized labor, and when they initially came up with the definition, they were thinking about jobs and livelihoods. They were thinking about the fact that as we phase out industries that are, toxic and harmful, whether it's fossil fuels or nuclear energy or weapons manufacturing, etc., let's not forget the workers, because it's not their fault that they ended up working in these damaging industries. Fair enough. And yes, they should get opportunity. They should not be left behind. But as you start to think about this question of just transition more from first principles of justice, it becomes obvious that we need to think about a lot more than only jobs and livelihoods, though we should think about jobs and livelihoods as we define for ourselves what a just transition looks like. Okay? Okay. So this is an excerpt from the full definition of just transition from the Climate Justice Alliance, which I strongly urge all of you to read It's online at the CJA website. I won't go through all of it, but just highlight a few terms. It's a vision-led, unifying, and place-based set of principles, processes, and practices. And they build economic and political power, and they shift from an extractive to a regenerative economy. And going back to what I said earlier about the process must be just, the transition itself must be just and equitable. Okay? So let's engage in some thinking around these questions. So, just in the interest of time, I'll take one response to several of these questions and then kind of race through the others. So, what does an extractive economy mean to you for our energy system? Can one person respond to that? Yes, sir. Exactly. That was simple.
Fossil fuels was what he said.
What about our food system? Can one person say what does an extractive food system look like? Factory farms, exactly. What about our transportation system? What does an extractive transportation system look like? Can one person address that?
Single occupancy vehicles.
Exactly.
Single occupancy vehicles.
Yes. What about housing? Can someone answer? Gentrification, exactly. That's what an extractive housing system looks like. What about an extractive healthcare system? One person? Exactly. For-profit hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, insurance, etc., that extract profit rather than provide healthcare, right? Okay, I will race through the others. An extractive economy for workers and labor. We see it all around us, but I'll give just one example, which is our so-called new tech overlords. Take a company like Amazon, okay? They call themselves part of this shining, glittering new economy, except they are replicating the good old sweatshop in their distribution centers and even for their white-collar employees. If you hear about the conditions under which their software engineers work with, people getting fired for falling sick, people getting fired for being pregnant, etc. Happens routinely even to relatively privileged white-collar workers at tech companies like Amazon, and that's an extractive economy. What about waste? Well, waste itself is a form of 5 minutes? Okay. Waste itself is a form of extraction. The fact that our society generates so much garbage, right? For borders and immigration, there's two systems of extraction happening there. People are forced to move from countries in the global south because of rampant extraction of resources from those countries that drives people into poverty. For example, someone mentioned the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the conditions they impose on countries to extract resources for them, force people to migrate because of the resulting poverty. And then, once they get here, immigrant workers are ruthlessly exploited because they are vulnerable, especially if they are undocumented. I think it was a poultry factory somewhere in the south where there was a massive ice raid recently. Sorry? Mississippi, right. The workers there had been organizing against management abuse, and then there was the ice raid, right? Mass incarceration, another form of extraction. It literally extracts human beings from communities, locks them up, and forces them to do practically free labor. It's like a continuation of slavery, okay? in terms of race and white supremacy, race and white supremacy, racism and white supremacy are a form of extraction, and that plays out in our immigration system, in our mass incarceration system, in gentrification. Again and again, you see white supremacy being extractive. Militarism and empire, another form of extraction. Because if you can't grab the resources of a country through a free trade agreement or an IMF loan, you invade that country. And that's what happened, for instance, to Iraq in 2003. So militarism is also a form of extraction. And therefore, for all of these, for each and every one of these, we need to go back to first principles, figure out what is extractive about the current way in which we operate, and turn it on its head. Just in the interest of time, I will give you just one example, our transportation system. Someone mentioned single occupancy vehicles as being a form of extraction, and that's exactly right. Can we envision free public transportation? What could be more essential than transportation? People need to get to work, they need to get to school, to medical appointments, etc. Can we envision publicly controlled, free public transportation powered by renewable electricity using a publicly owned electric vehicle charging grid? These are the kinds of models we need to be thinking about of public, accessible, democratic control in order to remake our entire economy to be regenerative. Okay? Well, thank you. So, anyone have any burning questions? Yes, ma'am? Yes, I would love to. So the Climate Justice Alliance is a largely nationwide but also international alliance of grassroots and frontline-led organizations who are working to end the extractive economy like we were talking about and build the regenerative economy from the bottom up. And currently there are some 70 or so member organizations. Yes. Some 70 member organizations from throughout the country, but also from elsewhere, like the Caribbean, and aren't there Canadian members too, Senova? No? Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And go to the CJA website, climatejusticealliance.org, and you'll find a lot more stuff. And in the interest of time, just one more question maybe from anyone? Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Can you give an example of inspiration where you have seen a successful or small transformation in a society that leads towards a just transition?
Okay, I'll give you one example from actually a community where a couple of different CJA members work, and that's Richmond, California. It's a city that's in the shadow of a refinery, Chevron's huge refinery with, horrific local pollution impacts, but that community is organizing. They compelled Chevron to provide funding for a community-owned solar farm that's owned by by people in Richmond. They have built their bike collective to teach young people in the city to ride their own bicycles, to repair their own bicycles. They have an amazing like community garden there with like I think 3 locations at this point who grow healthy organic food for themselves, which they also provide to their schools. And I've had the privilege of going to Richmond, California, and seeing how this marginalized, vast majority people of color community in the shadow of an oil refinery is self-organizing for justice. That's a truly inspiring example. Okay, thank you.